looking at your book, you begin your refutation of the idea that Christianity has not been overall a force for good by looking at the Puritans and how they shaped our nation. And we can get into some of the maybe unfair criticisms and caricatures of Puritans here in a minute. But how is it that Puritans shaped our nation? Obviously, we've got scenes in our minds of pilgrims and things like that. But I don't know if everyone really understands and grasps the contributions they made that are still being felt now.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let me begin briefly by the criticisms, because I think most people, when they think about the Pilgrims or the Puritans, they're thinking about Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, Arthur Miller's The Crucible. The Puritans are mean-spirited theocrats who were worried that someone somewhere is having fun. When you actually look at the Puritans, you see that the exact opposite is true, or close to the exact opposite. The Pilgrims and the Puritans who followed them came over to America to create a shining city on a hill. They applied the Bible to political, social, and legal institutions. And in doing so, they came up with some of the most Republican institutions that the world had ever seen. More men could vote in Massachusetts Bay than anywhere else, a higher percentage than anywhere else, anytime in the world, from ancient Greek democracy well up into English democracy. The American Puritans blew them away. Now, you'll note I said men, and yes, only men could vote. But no one should be shocked. Women couldn't vote anywhere, and they really couldn't until we get well into the 19th century. And so, again, I'm not saying that the Puritans figured out everything perfectly or that they became 21st century good Democrats, small d Democrats, but they created these wonderfully Republican institutions. They had a very healthy fear of government, so they strictly limited government by law. They had the rule of law, not the rule of men. They reformed criminal statutes. You could be put to death in England for many, 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 many crimes, including stealing just a tiny amount of property. The Puritans looked at many of these criminal laws and said, no, the appropriate penalty for theft is restitution. You should, if you steal a cow, you should give the cow back and an additional cow. And so the criminal laws in Massachusetts Bay were far more humane than they were in England. And we could go on and on. Again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm arguing that these folks were 21st century liberal Republicans, small r Republican, just that they really, the advances they made in political thought, in legal thought, in social policies were wonderful.
So they really don't deserve a lot of the caricature that they've gathered over the years.
No, that's exactly right. And I even address some of these more flippant things. Arthur Miller, if you believed him, would think that you only had one holiday, that the Puritans only celebrated one holiday. This is completely false. They were always feasting. And when they would do things like have a militia muster, oftentimes that ended in the tavern where there was great rejoicing. They were not puritanical when it comes to sex, right? In fact, you could be disciplined by your church if you denied your husband or wife the pleasures of the marriage bed. And so I talk about some of these more flippant things, but again, when it comes to the major societal, political, legal institutions, they really made wonderful advances, and they should be given credit for them.
So did they start to kind of become the boogeymen with the same mindset that you might see later in a 1619 project? Was that just developing over time in our society where those who seem to be religious fundamentalists are pointed out more and more as society becomes increasingly quote unquote progressive as being retrograde and bigoted and outdated?
I think that's right, but it takes until the late 19th century. So if you look at the early 19th century, Daniel Webster is praising the Puritans. Alexis de Tocqueville, the wonderful commentator who visited America from France, gives the Puritans great credit for getting America going in a democratic direction. It's not until you get to the late 19th century where you have some intellectuals, not all intellectuals, but some intellectuals who are becoming very progressive in their theology, and they look back at the Puritans and they're embarrassed by them. And it certainly is fair to critique them, but many of the critiques are simply unfair. They go and critique the Puritans for things that they, in fact, did not do. And then I think scholars pick up on this in the 20th century. And so it's very, very common to have even Christians who should, like the Puritans, have some sense that they were legalistic, mean spirited theocrats when they really weren't.
Yeah. And when it comes to their impact on political institutions and seeing what their mindset was, how should we understand something like the Mayflower Compact? You know, that's something that we learn about in school and we read. I saw some recent criticism online that surprised me a little bit. That was suggesting from a fairly conservative Christian thinker that was somewhat inappropriate to try and establish those norms of society and agree upon those from a Christian perspective. What are your thoughts on that, and what can we learn? What were the Pilgrims attempting to do with something like the Mayflower Compact?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. So, of course, the Puritans, just like all Christians today, should recognize that all political authority comes from God. But the way in which it's substantiated can differ, right? Um, Political authority could be instantiated in a king, in a monarch, right? And you get to be a monarch because of who you are born to. Or you could have an aristocracy where you have a House of Lords and you get to sit in the House of Lords because of who your mommy is, right? And who your family is. The Puritans, on the other hand, were profoundly democratic, small d democratic. They believed that individuals were equal. And so when it came time to create a political community, these individuals came together and they consented to be governed by one another. And then they created democratic institutions, which again were the most democratic the world had ever
Hmm.
seen. Virtually all males could vote in elections, and they had elections all the time, every 6 months.
Wow.
And they were electing members of the lower house, members of the upper house, and for many, many years, the governor. Eventually, after the English Civil War, a royal governor was sent to Massachusetts, but not to Connecticut. So, Connecticut, throughout all this time, the people are regularly going and voting on every major political official. And I've just kind of focused on the colonial wide ones. You also had local um, town officials and selectmen and this sort of thing. And they had some laws that were just, I think, wonderful. For instance, Connecticut had a law that required every family to have a Bible and a copy of the Westminster Catechism. And if you could not afford one, one would be provided to
Wow.
you. They also required that all children must learn how to read. And this is, of course, what you would expect of a very Protestant people who believe in sola scriptura, that is, a Bible alone as their sole guide for faith and practice, and the priesthood of all believers. Well, if you're going to take that seriously, that means all individuals need to be able to read. And what we see in New England is almost universal male literacy. And I'm sorry, that's how historians measure it, male literacy. But actually, there's good reason to believe that female literacy was improving dramatically, far more so than you would see anywhere else in the world at that time.